Welcome to the Beware Collectivism podcast. This podcast is designed as an analytical resource for students, policymakers, researchers, and informed citizens who seek to understand the wide-ranging consequences of the political and ideological movement broadly referred to as woke progressivism. Over the past 2 decades, this movement has expanded from university campuses into every major sphere of public life: corporate boardrooms, government agencies, school curricula, media institutions, and international policy bodies. The central argument of this podcast is not that compassion, environmental stewardship, or equal opportunity are unworthy goals. Rather, it is that the specific policy mechanisms chosen by the progressive movement to advance these goals, regulatory mandates, government subsidies, identity-based resource allocation, speech restrictions, and central economic planning, carry enormous and frequently ignored costs: economic costs, costs to individual liberty, costs to institutional trust, and costs to the social fabric of free societies. Each episode examines a distinct dimension of this phenomenon, drawing on economic data, historical precedent, and comparative policy analysis from multiple countries. Readers are encouraged to evaluate the evidence independently, weigh competing interpretations, and arrive at their own conclusions about the proper relationship between government power, collective goals, and individual freedom. The questions raised here: how much power should governments hold over private economic decisions? Who defines equity, and who enforces it? What is the true cost of carbon zero mandates on working families? Are among the most important questions a free society can ask. This podcast is an attempt to ask them seriously.
The economics of equity, redistribution, regulation, and decline. Equity versus equality, the economic distinction. The shift from equality of opportunity to equity of outcomes is not merely a semantic difference, it represents a fundamental restructuring of economic incentives that carries profound consequences for productivity, innovation, and long-term growth. Market economies function because individuals face incentives to invest effort, take risks, and create value. When outcomes are guaranteed regardless of input, or when individuals are penalized for above-average performance while others are rewarded for below-average performance, the incentive structure that drives economic dynamism is undermined. Economists from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman to Thomas Sowell have documented the relationship between economic freedom and prosperity. The Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, which measures freedom across 5 dimensions: government size, rule of law, sound money, trade freedom, and regulation, consistently finds that nations with higher economic freedom have substantially higher income levels, faster growth, lower poverty rates, and better environmental outcomes than nations with lower economic freedom. The cost of progressive redistribution programs. Progressive equity agendas are operationalized primarily through redistributive fiscal policy. The following analysis examines the economic costs of major progressive spending programs. Federal welfare programs, combined. $1.2 trillion per year. Poverty rates largely unchanged since 1970s. Work disincentives, family fragmentation. Student loan forgiveness programs. $300 to $500 billion. Degree inflation, no income improvement. Moral hazard, university cost inflation. Affordable Care Act subsidies. $200 billion per year. Coverage expanded, costs rose sharply. Premium increases, employer exit from market. Racial equity executive orders. Unquantified billions. Disparities persist across most metrics. Meritocracy erosion, legal uncertainty. Small business equity grants, race-based. $50 billion EST. Challenged in courts, limited recipients. Discrimination against non-targeted groups. The welfare trap and work disincentives. One of the most well-documented economic costs of progressive welfare expansions is the creation of welfare traps, situations in which individuals rationally choose not to work or earn more because doing so would reduce their government benefits by more than the additional income gained. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion and subsidy structure would reduce labor supply by the equivalent of 2.5 million full-time workers, not because people were forced out of work, but because the benefit structure made work less financially rational. Similarly, economists studying SNAP, food stamps, housing assistance, Medicaid, and cash assistance programs have consistently found that the implicit marginal tax rates embedded in means-tested benefit phase-outs can exceed 80% for some workers, meaning that for every additional dollar earned, a worker loses 80 cents in benefits. This is not an argument against all safety nets, but it is a powerful argument against poorly designed progressive benefit structures that trap people in dependency. Thomas Sowell on equity. Economist Thomas Sowell, one of the most penetrating critics of progressive race and equity policy, has argued that the fundamental question is not what are your intentions, but what are your results? He documents extensively that programs designed to advance minority economic progress have in many cases produced stagnation, family breakdown, and the destruction of previously thriving communities. The political class that designs these programs rarely bears the costs. ESG investing, when ideology distorts capital markets. Environmental, social, and governance, ESG, investing represents the financialization of progressive ideology, the imposition of political and social criteria on investment decisions that were previously made on the basis of risk and return. By the early 2020s, ESG had become a multi-trillion-dollar global investment category, with major asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street incorporating ESG scores into their investment processes and using their enormous voting power at shareholder meetings to advance progressive agendas at publicly traded companies. The economic problems with ESG are fundamental. It diverts capital from productive, profitable industries, energy, manufacturing, defense, toward politically favored sectors, regardless of their actual risk-adjusted returns. It exposes pension funds and retirement savers to lower returns in the name of ideological conformity, a cost borne disproportionately by working-class savers who lack the wealth to absorb underperformance. It empowers a small number of politically aligned asset managers to exert enormous influence over corporate governance without democratic accountability. It creates incentives for greenwashing, the performance of environmental virtue without substantive improvement, as companies conform to ESG metrics without changing their actual behavior. Studies of ESG fund performance have found that ESG funds have not consistently outperformed standard market indices, and in some periods have substantially underperformed, particularly in 2022, when the energy sector surged while ESG funds that excluded fossil fuels suffered losses. Meanwhile, the fees charged by ESG funds are typically higher than comparable index funds, representing a direct financial cost to investors.
We've reached the end of this week's episode of the Beware Collectivism podcast. We appreciate you joining us this week and hope you subscribe and join us again next week for another episode. Check out our website as well as our other podcasts centered on philosophy and democracy by visiting the notes below. Thank you and have a wonderful week ahead.